Senator Cruz, something that routinely surprises me about U.S. politicians, especially conservatives, is their support for Guantanamo Bay. Considering that of the 37 who are still imprisoned there, the vast majority have never been convicted with anything or charged, and 17 are being held indefinitely with no plans for transfer. And these people are routinely being denied the regular due process that we ordinarily afford people. Additionally, some of the methods of interrogation include rectal feeding and waterboarding, and in one case, one prisoner claimed that he was used as a training dummy by the CIA and that he suffered brain damage. I guess my question is, how can America claim certain ideals while also maintaining that it has to have these facilities open?
Well, because there are enemies who hate us, and the U.S. Constitution applies to Americans in America. It doesn't apply to terrorists, to enemy terrorists in foreign countries that are trying to kill us. On September 11th, 2001, I still remember where I was. I was in Washington, D.C. We lived less than a mile from the Pentagon. My wife, Heidi, was working at the White House at the time. We lost a very good friend of ours who was in the plane that flew into the Pentagon in the most horrific act of terrorism in United States history. That act of warfare came from an ideology, radical Islamic terrorism that wages jihad in America. And we went and waged war. And you say, well, gosh, we didn't provide due process to them. Well, you know what? When we send a fighter jet over to Afghanistan and we identify people who are al-Qaeda or in later manifestations, ISIS, al-Nusra, there are a whole series of radical Islamic terrorist organizations, and we fire missiles at them and blow them up, they don't get due process either. Warfare is a dangerous process. If you look at Guantanamo Bay, it is explicitly outside of U.S. jurisdiction. The reason we've housed them there is so that the federal courts would not place them under their scrutiny. Now, that being said, the federal courts have asserted considerable authority over Guantanamo, even though it was a foreign jurisdiction. And you noted enhanced interrogation. I will say it is U.S. law. It is U.S. policy now under both Republicans and Democrats that we do not torture people. And so the example you gave of using that individual as a dummy and beating him, if that happened, that was a violation of law, and anyone who did so would be prosecuted. We don't torture them, but we do keep them incapacitated. The people who are there are the very worst of the worst. And if you look at the history of releasing terrorists, Barack Obama released a significant number of terrorists from Guantanamo Bay. Joe Biden released a significant number of terrorists, particularly from Afghanistan, and we release them and they turn around and a large percentage of them come back and attack us again. You remember the guy who blew up and murdered 13 servicemen and women in Afghanistan? That man had been imprisoned at Bagram, and when Biden abandoned the Bagram airfield, he was released and turned around and murdered 13 servicemen and women. So why shouldn't we close Guantanamo Bay? Because I don't want terrorists to murder Americans.
You know, just to add, I agree with that, and to add a little bit of context, you mentioned waterboarding as an example of torture. Waterboarding is not torture. We waterboard our own troops in training, so unless we're torturing our own troops, I guess we'll have a lot of lawsuits on our hands in that case. I don't think that quite counts. But furthermore, one of the arguments against enhanced interrogation or even against torture is that we have agreed in international law to afford certain courtesies to enemy combatants who abide by the laws of war. Now some people have argued that we should extend these courtesies even to terrorists. This is a very, very bad idea. The reason that we extend these courtesies to certain enemy combatants is so that we can protect civilians. So we say you need to wear a uniform, you need to not target civilians to achieve your political goals. So if we extend those same courtesies to terrorists who very directly are targeting civilians to achieve political goals, we undermine the entire purpose of those protections in the first place. So to borrow a line from my friend Andrew Klavan, I think that waterboarding jihadis should be an Olympic sport, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
But I will say, notwithstanding your and Andrew Klavan's view, it is currently against U.S. law, so we're not doing so right now.
Sorry, just with all due respect, my question wasn't entirely about releasing prisoners. I know you brought that up. It also, it was mostly to address the waterboarding thing. We know that the studies suggest that torture doesn't work. I would just like to clarify, or enhanced interrogation, sorry. My question was not about obviously releasing these people. That's a horrible consequence, what happened, obviously. It was mostly about humane treatment.
So listen, and I agree we should provide humane treatment, and it's one of the things America does that is different. It's why U.S. law prohibits torture. And I'm glad you say that you agree that these folks shouldn't be released. I can tell you over the last decade, I have repeatedly forced votes on whether or not we should release people out of Guantanamo, and Joe Biden and the Democrats are pressing to do so. When we have votes on this, they vote party line. I think we are likely to see an effort from the Biden administration to shut Guantanamo Bay down. And if that happens, or not to shut the base down, but to release the prisoners, to shut the detention facility down, if that happens, I believe the result of that will be that Americans will die because those terrorists will go back and commit more terrorist attacks against us.